Champagne is possibly the most delicious, complex, and beloved of all wines. However, looking at a label can be confusing. And how many times have you been at a party and seen something like this?
I don't believe I've ever had French champagne before.
Oh, actually, all champagne is French. It's named after the region. Americans, of course, don't recognize the convention, so it becomes that thing of calling all of their sparkling wines champagne, even though by definition they're not.
I know when I was just learning about wine, and since I'm a smart aleck, I would probably say something like Wayne.
It's a lot like Star Trek, The Next Generation. In many ways, it's superior, but will never be as recognized as the original.
Champagne can only be made from the region of Champagne in France. It's a few hours east of Paris. It's a cooler, damper climate, so historically grape varieties would struggle to ripen all the way. That means they would have a little bit more acidity than sugar. The region's often romanticized, but if you travel through this big region, a lot of it is just cornfields. Champagnes are some of the most food-friendly wines in the world. They can start with salad. They can take you all the way to dessert. If you're with a bunch of wine geeks at dinner, just order a champagne. That'll cover almost everybody. There are 7 authorized grapes in Champagne, although 3 are the most common: Pinot Noir, Meunier, and Chardonnay. The first 2 are red grapes. You also have small plantings of Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, Petit Meslier, and Arbonne. Over 2/3 of the grapes grown in Champagne are actually red grapes. It's ironic because we think of Champagne as a white sparkling wine, although there's rosé Champagne made as well. The first Champagnes were actually pink because the color comes from the skins. The monks didn't know how to separate the skins from the juice, therefore Champagne was pink. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago was actually a still wine. The first sparkling wines weren't discovered in Champagne, actually were discovered in Limoux in the Languedoc in the south of France. Modern Champagne as we know it really came to form in the 19th century as producers learned more about the science of making a good bottle of bubbles without the wine exploding. Because Champagne is a French wine, the labels can be very confusing to a non-francophone. I'm going to practically explain a few things you'll see on the label, then we'll taste 2 different kinds of Champagne side by side blind. The first thing you have to understand is how Champagne's made. That creates the basis for understanding the rest of the label. The Champagnes that most of you will see on the shelf are non-vintage, also labeled as NV. What that means is they're made from grapes from a bunch of different harvests. Usually fine wines are made from a single year harvest. Champagnes, you use a lot of different harvests. You ferment the wine, you store that wine, so then master blenders can come in and they can put together a little recipe to give a signature style of that winery or that house. When you blend in some of those aged wines, it adds a lot of complexity that us wine geeks go crazy over when it comes to Champagne. You'll also have vintage Champagne because Champagne is a cooler, damper climate. Not every year is great, but in great vintages, producers will make a vintage Champagne, and this is usually a rarity of something like this, which is actually the Rare Champagne 2013. That's the name of it. I think it's only been made in 12 different vintages. These wines are usually bought by collectors and they're a lot more expensive. So if you don't see a vintage or a year on the label, that's a non-vintage Champagne. If it is a vintage Champagne, it will have the year on the label. In general, to get a good bottle of Champagne, you're going to start at $50 and it goes up to thousands of dollars. Non-vintage Champagnes are usually the most affordable. Champagne initially is made as a base wine, just like other dry wines. It's then put into a bottle and then a small amount of yeast and sugar, a process known as tirage, is done. There's a second fermentation that happens in the bottle that creates carbon dioxide. During that second fermentation in the bottle, the yeast cells die, and Champagne, when it's going through this process, is usually stored like this. The dead yeast fall to the neck of the bottle. The wine then rests on those dead leaves, which gives some of those toasty, creamy notes and adds to the complexity. Non-vintage Champagnes have to be kept on these leaves for at least 15 months in the bottle. Vintage Champagnes have to be kept on the leaves for at least 36 months, although in practice a lot of Champagnes, a lot of houses hold the wine on the leaves a lot longer. The neck is then frozen. There's a machine. Those frozen sediments shoot out. Then the wine is topped up, sometimes with a little sugar, and then labeled and sold. The biggest confusion when it comes to buying Champagne is the dryness level. I'm going to use Wine Folly because she did a great graphic. Dry Champagne you're going to have is Brut Nature, also can be labeled as Brut Zero, Zero Dosage. Then as you move down the sweetness scale, you'll see Extra Brut, then Brut. The sweetest Champagnes, ironically, are extra dry, dry, or sec, demi-sec, half dry, or doux. I know it's a little bit confusing that the word dry means the Champagne will actually be a little bit sweeter. There's a reason for this. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, some of the greatest wines in the world were actually sweet wines. In the 18th century, producers started to realize the Brits liked a little bit less sugar. They started to move away from doux or those sweet wines and then move into half-dry, demi-sec, dry, and then extra dry, which are less sweet than doux, but still, by today's standards, pretty sweet. In the 19th century, when even drier wines were more fashionable, that's when producers started coming out with Brut, Extra Brut, and Brut Nature. Doux champagnes might still exist when you're there. I hardly ever see them. Once in a while, I'll see demi-sec or extra dry, but for the most part, Brut is the most common champagne you're going to see on the shelf. I prefer Brut a lot of times to Extra Brut or Brut Nature. Champagne is so high in acidity that you need a little bit of residual sugar, just a touch, to balance out that acidity. This happens in things like German Rieslings, where dry Rieslings actually have residual sugar to balance out the acidity. Think about a lemon. If you just ate a lemon, the acidity would be way too tart, way too sour for a lot of people. But if you put it in some water, you put a little bit of sugar in it, all of a sudden it becomes mouth-watering, fresh, and delicious. The champagne market is dominated by the Grand Marque, or great brands. These are things you'll commonly see like Moet, Taittinger, Bollinger, Piper Heidsieck, which we have here. The trendy thing nowadays in the wine world for sommeliers, they want grower champagnes. What happens in Champagne, there are a lot more growers and less brands, so all the farmers would sell their grapes to the big houses like the Piper Heidsieck that we have here. Now, growers with big holdings of property want to make their own champagnes. Grower champagnes are really trendy, like the one that we're going to taste here today, Champagne Jeeper. In English, we would say Jeeper. On both Grand Marque and Grower Champagne, you might see the terms Premier Cru or Grand Cru. Cru is a French word that translates to growth. It's used to describe a vineyard, group of vineyards, or a village. Premier Cru is supposed to be really good. Grand Cru is supposed to be the best. The Cru system is so confusing in France. In Burgundy, it's by vineyard location. In Bordeaux, it's by the chateau or property itself. Champagne, it's by the village. I know, wine is confusing. In Champagne, Premier Cru or Grand Cru are top villages that produce the best grapes. Now, even though quality is a big part of that, in Champagne, Premier Cru and Grand Cru villages were assigned by proximity to the big cities like Epernay and Reims. The big houses had their wineries there. They didn't have cooling trucks back in the day, so whatever villages were closer to those main towns means that the grapes would be fresher. It would make better wine. Therefore, they were Grand Crus. Then you step out a little bit, then you have Premier Crus. Then you have the regular village. With modern technology these days in Champagne, yes, Grand Cru, Premier Cru is prestigious, but I've seen a lot of champagnes that are not labeled as Premier and Grand Cru that are outstanding. By the way, I actually did a vlog about champagne and the components that make great champagne where I visited both big houses and growers. I'll pin it in the top comment below. 3 other terms that might be confusing to people that are just getting into champagne. You'll see Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noir, or Rosé. If there's none of these titles on the label, that just means there's a blend of white and red grapes to make up that cuvee. If you see Blanc de Blanc, that means white wine from white grapes. It's usually made from Chardonnay. If you see Blanc de Noir, that means white wine from red grapes. It's usually made from Pinot Noir or Meunier. Rosé champagne is different than a lot of other wines because it's one of the few wine regions in Europe where you can blend white and red base wines together to make a rosé. You can also make a rosé champagne by keeping the red grapes in contact with the skins just a little bit longer, which adds a little bit more color. Rosé champagne to me is a little bit funny because there's like a 25% premium. It's more of a luxury product, which I don't understand because most of the grapes in Champagne are red, so that I don't really get that. Blanc de Blanc is also usually more expensive because there are less white grapes. A lot of people like Blanc de Blancs for the high acidity. I prefer Blanc de Noirs for the subtle red fruit and strawberry notes, and we're going to blind taste the difference between the two here today. Don't be embarrassed if you say Blanc de Blancs or Blanc de Noirs. Before I brown bag these champagnes, I'm going to show you how to open a bottle of champagne, make the video more useful for you. Champagne is a sparkling wine. There's carbonation. You want to make sure you get it real cold. Otherwise, the cork will pop off and you can really hurt somebody. First, you take off the capsule. There's a cage here. I unscrew it. Some keep the cage on. It's just a safety measure, just in case the cork blows off. I like to take it off a little bit. What you do is you take the bottle at a 45-degree angle. You hold the cork, and you start to twist the bottle. And as you twist the bottle, you'll slowly feel the cork start to come out. You want to actually make as little noise as possible. People like the big pop, but in champagne, you want to keep those bubbles. Let's see. Not bad, not bad. Preserve these with my Coravin sparkling system because I'm the only one here. I want to be able to drink these for later. This is a device used to preserve champagne. I did a blind taste test video about it. I'll also pin that in the comment below. Another useful tip to keep the bubbles, I like to keep my glass at a 45-degree angle as you pour. Okay, I'm gonna get somebody to mix these up for me and then we're gonna blind taste. Use my Rito 002 glass. I do not like using flutes when it comes to champagne. You don't get the aromas in it. I like using white or even red wine glasses. We're drinking classier wines, feel like I had to do something, so I put the glasses on. I don't want to put the jacket on because I'm too fat right now and I can barely fit in the jacket. Champagne Gipper is owned by the same man that owns Cos d'Estournel, the famous chateau in Bordeaux. When I went to En Premiere a few years ago and visited Cos d'Estournel, I also met Tony Parker, who is invested in this champagne house. He played in the NBA for the San Antonio Spurs. I'm a huge basketball fan.
Parker pulls back. That's a three-pointer. It's good. Tony Parker ties the game.
I'm usually not starstruck by people, but when I was there, I definitely had my picture taken with him. Let's taste the difference between these two champagnes. Let's start out with wine number 1 here. Wine 1, definitely get some of, I think this, initially, I get to compare the difference, but I think this might be the Blanc de Noir because you get some of the strawberry type notes, and these are real subtle. Get lemon, fresh cut apple, toastiness, really like when you come out of the bakery in France or come out of any bakery, you get that toastiness. That's what champagne's known for. Those flavors can come from the dead leaves and the aging. Ah, it's biscuity. I gotta take these glasses off while I taste. Let's compare the difference to wine 2. Wine 1 smells a little bit softer. Wine 2 is a little more intense. It's got more lemony flavors, baked apple. It's just a little bit more explosive, flowery. This one has more biscuit and aged type notes, while this one has a little bit more mineral and strawberry type notes. Just subtle. Let's taste the difference because a lot of times Blanc de Blanc have higher acidity made of Chardonnay, so you can feel it on the palate. So good. Real fine bead of bubbles. It doesn't have piercing acidity, long finish. I definitely get strawberry notes. I think I pick out Blanc de Noir often because I grew up on a farm. We had a big you-pick strawberry patch. And I remember those aromas in the air. That's what I think wine number 1 is. Let's go with wine 2. These are both non-vintage champagne, so different vintages, different harvests blended in. More lemony, more laser-like finish, like an arrow it shoots straight down your palate. These are both dry wines because they're both Brut. Wine 1 tastes a little bit sweeter. I feel, even though it's a dry wine, I feel like Blanc de Noir's fruit can be like that. I like the Blanc de Noirs. It's softer. What I mean by that, doesn't have piercing acidity, or in red wines, when you say softer, the tannins aren't as big. A lot of geeks, and it's so funny because I love higher acidity, go for Blanc de Blanc because of that acidity, that sharpness. Oh, so good. Okay, put the glasses on for the reveal, feel more sophisticated. In this case here, with this house, which this house makes all spectacular champagnes, I'm gonna be doing more champagne content because I'm starting to get champagne samples this year. I feel like I'm starting to make it in the wine biz. I prefer Blanc de Noir normally, but in this case, I prefer what I think is the Blanc de Blanc. I'm gonna go wine 1, 93, wine 2, 94 plus. It just has that spine of acidity, make it age longer. Let's start out with wine 1, 93 points. I think it's the Blanc de Noir. That softer, sweeter fruit. Let's see here. Let's see if I'm right. I'm not. The first one is the Champagne Gipper Blanc de Blanc Brut. I am so shocked. Usually I feel like it's easy to pick out the difference between Blanc de Blanc, Blanc de Noir. It comes down to the house style too. This comes in at 72 bucks. Blanc de Blanc, usually a little more rare, a little bit more expensive, but wow. I get it mixed up, and this is the perception of higher acidity. You gotta trust your own palate, especially as you learn to taste more and more wines. I would have beat myself up a couple years ago saying, what's wrong with me? Why didn't I get this right? But that's why learning about wine can be confusing because it's hard to make generalities. There are so many factors like the producer, the vintage, the different grapes, the different blending. Tasting is subjective. You get what you get. I prefer this, 94 plus points. It's, well, I say I always like Blanc de Noir, and I do. This is the Champagne Gipper Blanc de Noir. Non-vintage, this comes in at $60, made from Pinot Noir and Meunier. The old term for Meunier was Pinot Meunier. The people in Champagne like to say just Meunier now to distinguish the difference between Pinot Noir and Meunier. Wow, so tell me, do you drink a lot of champagne? Do you have any favorite brands? Do you prefer Blanc de Blanc or Blanc de Noir? I'd love to know. Drop it in the comments below. Wow.